If you want to punish white for trying to go for this early fried liver trick out of the opening, this video is for you. We're going to take a look at Hikaru Nakamura and the line he likes to play against the fried liver. It's very aggressive. You sacrifice a pawn, so if you're that kind of player, you'll love it. But if not, still, just the game we'll see where he highlights this line in action is just crazy. Both sides are sacrificing pieces left, right, and center, and it's a lot of fun to watch. So the match we're going to watch is Hikaru against the Indian GM Pranav. And like we're talking about, it's going to be a fried liver game. So it's e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and then Hikaru invites the fried liver with knight f6. Obviously, it's not the only move, but Pranav's trying his chances. He jumps forward with his knight. And now, if you're going to play this, the main move to remember, if you're going to remember anything, is make sure you play d5. It's the only move here. You have to block off this connection with the bishop. In this position, white is forced to take. And now the fried liver is technically when the knight recaptures, because it looks like, hey, I can recapture there, get that pawn back. But the problem is there's this crazy knight f7 sacrifice. You don't want to let white do this. It's a lot of fun for white. So just don't think about recapturing that pawn. So the move Hikaru likes to do here starts out with knight a5. In this situation, most white players will then throw in this check, and there's two possibilities. I made a video on Magnus's favorite response, which is the simple bishop d7, and this one is very easy to play, and if you like endgames like Magnus, that's the one for you. But if you're a more aggressive player, Hikaru likes to play c6 here. This is the pawn sacrifice. White will then take back with the pawn, and now we are a pawn down, but black has plenty of compensation. So the compensation basically lies in the fact that you have more central space because of this e-pawn, and this knight is going to be a bit awkward. So I'll run you through a few of the lines, and then we'll get to see the game in action. So the tricky response for white is when they play this move queen f3. Basically, it pins the knight because of this x-ray with the undefended rook. And the best move is to not worry about this threat on the pawn and just keep developing. If you play bishop e7, and if white decides to be a bit greedy, decides to start taking everything here, now you're down 2 pawns, but you can see from the engine, it's just so much compensation for black. All these pieces are very loose. You're very well developed and solid, so you don't need to worry too much about that variation. The other main move, other than the one we'll see in the match, is bishop e2, and it's just important to remember these rough principles. So generally you want to kick this knight out as soon as you can. So h6 is great here. If the knight goes to f3, you always want to be thinking about pushing e4. Just keep throwing this knight around, and it'll soon start to run out of squares. The knight has to jump here, and then the best move here, even though this looks great, bishop d6, basically white can then push d4, and this knight becomes very solid, and your initiative is starting to evaporate. We can stop d4 by actually putting our bishop on c4. It lines up on that weak pawn, and you can see it's just we have compensation. You don't have to worry too much about being down a pawn. As long as you avoid trading too many pieces, you'll generally either get the pawn back, or you'll get a really quick checkmating attack on the king, so there's nothing to worry about. Going back to the game, Pranav's response and the other popular move here is dropping the bishop back to d3. Now this looks a little strange because you're blocking the advancement of your center pawn and making it hard for this dark squared bishop to develop, but that's not too big of a deal. You can always fianchetto your bishop like this, and because we saw before, a lot of black's compensation comes from this control in the center and the potential to push e4, so the bishop controlling that square is a big deal. So generally here, the setup and what Hikaru decides to do is to centralize your knight. It exposes an attack on this knight, so Pranav drops the knight back, and then Hikaru is just going to develop. This knight is attacking the e5 pawn, so you defend it. White will castle, and then Hikaru castles. White's next move is the natural rook e1, again attacking this central pawn, and Hikaru just decides to sacrifice it. He pushes the f pawn to f5, and white accepts the sacrifice, and now Hikaru is down 2 pawns. But he brings his queen to f6, just attacking this knight. The knight is forced to retreat, and then out of nowhere, Hikaru plays g5. You can see this is a very aggressive game. So down 2 pawns, the initiative is really starting on the king side. White decides to try and counterattack the knight, but honestly, it just brings it to a better square. Hikaru gets it to f4, always a great attacking position for these knights. Attacking this bishop as well, so the bishop is forced to retreat. And then comes g4, and out of nowhere, this knight is trapped. All of its escape squares are covered by the queen, And white is just going to be down a knight now. He just plays d4, getting some central space. Hikaru takes the knight. White brings the queen out. And it's still a pretty even game. You have 3 pawns for the knight and an incredibly unbalanced position. Hikaru has a very weak king. White has better central space. And you can see it's just looking ridiculous. So I see this position and I just see a hanging pawn. So I probably would have just taken here and lost because it's quite a bad move. Basically, if you take here, white suddenly gets the initiative because you have to remember black's king is super weak. So the rook comes to the d file and suddenly all these pieces are feeling very scattered and a bit vulnerable. So that's why you see Hikaru instead choose this passive looking knight e6 move, just dropping back because he needs to start consolidating his pieces. So white decides to start storming his pawns in the center, pushing his pawn and attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats, and then the pawn storm continues. He pushes b4, attacking this knight, but Hikaru decides now is the time to take that central pawn. Now that this bishop is out of the way and this x-ray is not as bad. And we are also counterattacking this rook. So if the pawn takes the knight, we take the rook and we're doing fine. So white offers an exchange of queens. Hikaru decides to accept, and still, he is still sacrificing this knight. And the idea is basically, if you take the knight, the bishop comes, and it's pinning the knight to the rook, and if you try and defend it, suddenly black has heaps of counterplay infiltrating to the second rank. So we don't see that. Instead, white just decides to bring his rook to the b file as well, and now we have Hikaru retreating with his knight. And still, it's an even game. White is down a piece, but now he only has 2 pawns as compensation for that piece. And we have white attacking now the knight. Hikaru defends the knight with his rook. We have just advancing, gaining space on the king side with the h-pawn. And Hikaru starts to bring his king to the center because you see it's starting to transition more to an endgame. In this position, white has a pawn majority on the queen side. It's 3 versus 2, so he decides to push his a-pawn, getting ready to try and create a passed pawn on the queen side. And Hikaru chooses this retreating move, knight to d8. Again, just a retreating move, but harmonizing his pieces, connecting the knights together, getting control back of this b-file with the rook, now that it's not blocked by the knight. And we see white just continuing this pawn storm, pushing b5. But this is starting to get a bit overzealous. It actually hangs this pawn immediately. But Hikaru decides first to counterattack this knight. The knight is defended. And then Hikaru comes in with the knight. And now, again, we still have Hikaru up a piece. And now there's only a single pawn compensation for white. The engine still thinks that white is fine. Black is only a small advantage and will be a draw with perfect play. But it's starting to look pretty tough. So white decides to centralize his rook. Hikaru then brings his knight closer to the king side. Maybe just closer to the king for more protection. And then the big blunder of the match here, white decides to attack the rook. Now, this looks fine. You'd think, okay, well, the rook has to move, and then he can move the knight. But the problem is, Hikaru can just take this knight and simultaneously defend the rook. So a bit of a mishap from white, maybe feeling low on time and a bit intimidated against Hikaru. Only a minute 6 left on the clock. But that was a big blunder, essentially just giving up a piece. And he just decides to resign here. Not worth playing on anymore. If you enjoyed this video of Hikaru taking on the fried liver, you'll probably enjoy watching Magnus take it on. He has a different style, a lot simpler to play, and you'll see in that video his beautiful endgame technique. So click the video above me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.